This doesn't look right either. Yes, integrating our history of Plymouth into the life of Plymouth. So how can we make this more, can you hear? Do I need to get closer? Okay, okay, there we go. What can we do to help integrate the history of our church into our lives today? What could make it interesting? There we go. So we think there are two themes to Plymouth's history, okay? One is continuity, that since the beginning of our church, there's always been social outreach. That's something that has been very prevalent. The music and arts has always been very prevalent at our church, and also theology and strong preaching. So those are three things that are pretty continuous throughout our history. Now there's some things that have changed over the years that we've been there. The constants have been carried out and differently in the context of each generation. So we look back at the 1800s, 1819s. They had a role of their own. It was a rough frontier town. And at that time, it was into civilizing people and Christianizing people. Those were the themes that were very prevalent during that time as we look at what we have in the archives. Then we get into the 1870s to the 1890s, and now we have a lot of immigrants coming here that are working in the milling industries. And so what we were really working with at that time was to teach them to read, because they needed to read and to speak English. And that included even children, because at that time there were still no child labor laws. And so we were being very careful about the children that were working too, that shouldn't be. Then we get to the social justice in the 2000s. And here again too, we were grappling with a whole different group of things, and a lot of it was affordable housing, okay? And what was happening during that time then, we've been really enduring and evolving into social and economic justice now in the 2000s, okay? And as we've been advancing and addressing these consequences of our past history, we've had a motivation then. Our motivation has become justice for the wounded of the past, okay? So what are some of the values of exploring our past? First, it helps us to understand who we are, okay? Knowing our past helps address the present and chart the future. So what was our life? What has our life been like, and where do we go? It gives us a perspective as we look at our history, from winning debates to programs and to progress toward justice, okay? It encourages us to critically think and difficult learning, okay? And with what we feel this really helps us to do is to open space for us to see the complexion and the complexity of the historical interpretations and the importance of considering different perspectives and accounts, which is very challenging, okay? It also encourages us to have humility as we look at what our forebears, what they did in their time, their condition in their time. We're looking at our conditions in our time as well. How might we then, the difficult question is, how are we going to be remembered in the future? So what will our archives say about us in 50 years when we look at what we are doing right now? So how can we share our history? Right now, there are several things that we do. We have um, flame articles in our flame art that comes out every month. We do Sunday forums. New member classes. We always go to the new member classes and talk about the archives and what it is and how they could participate if they wanted to. Exhibits. We have a wonderful exhibit that's been upstairs now for quite a while on the Needlers. It's a wonderful exhibit of the history of how it began, and it's a wonderful exhibit. So come up and look at it if you haven't seen it, and if you have, come and see it again. And there's displays in the displays where you can see the samplers that the women did before they could even start on the embroideries. And we also partner with the Minnesota Digital Library to provide access to some of our Plymouth stuff. What we need to be doing, and this is what's really important too as we look at the future, we have to expand the presence of Plymouth's website. So we hope that we can be doing that on the website to be able to have a historical, or the archives, where we can have things that you can access. And there's things that we're putting on Past Perfect right now that's generating a lot of things on a computer, on a website, but that isn't yet available to all of us on websites. So that's something we want to do. We want to expand online access, which again is part of the website. And then also to encourage our youth to become more involved. And that has happened in some respects. There's been some things, Sunday school students have come up, and Mary has done like a, what would you call it? Scavenger hunt with them, and gives, and so there's things we can do, and Nina's very aware of that, and we've talked with Nina, and she knows that too. The thing that's really holding us back in a lot of ways is the lack of resources. And you'll hear more from Mary, as we look at what do we save, how much do we save, and it costs money to do all of that. And we also want to hear from you. If there's things, ideas you have of what would be some good things to have in our archives, to have as an exhibit. We're always looking for ideas and what to write about in the flame, so please give us any ideas you have. So what's a historian's challenge? And what we really need to do is move toward a more objective perspective and a more inclusive presentation of the past. And I think that this is something we really need to work on. There's been a shift in evidence. Look at our historic sites. The Fort Snelling is changing things, including the indigenous folks more in there. The state capitol took some pictures out of the governor's office and put them in another space in the building. We're looking at those kinds of things. How many buildings, schools, and even a lake have been changed their names, okay? And at Plymouth, there's a lot of things we are already doing. If you think of the arts, Theater 45, music, they had the Beyonce Mass here how long ago? And we've also are certainly in recognizing the indigenous folks a lot, simply by even what's in the bulletin and on our website in the Sunday mornings. We also have to recognize that we are conditioned by our time and place, okay? So right now, as we are making records of ourselves, we are generating primary resources for future generations, just as the generations before us did, okay? We must acknowledge that we may never know the full story. We just feel like we're peeling back the onion all the time. As we look at the archives, as Hal will tell us, there's been some really interesting things that we find every Tuesday when we're all there. We have wonderful conversations about things we're experiencing and finding as we do things. So it's a very challenging time for Plymouth. And now we'll let Mary go on with the archivist role.
All right, so I'm wearing the hat of the archivist, not the historian. And what is it that we do? We want to manage, our basic function and purpose as archivists is to manage our historical records so they are preserved, easy to find, and accessible to clients. And those clients may be within our church or beyond our church. So in a nutshell, what we are doing is we are managing the primary sources that historians use to provide an inclusive history of our past. Some of the things that we do, well, first of all, we have to receive materials, and for us, most of it is actually sitting here in Plymouth. We just have to get to it and organize it. And the first decision we have to make, is this something that we want to retain? And there are some things that we clearly know that we should retain, we've retained for years, but there's a lot of gray areas that we come across and we all look at each other. Is this something we should or shouldn't retain? And so that's something moving forward that we really need to work on, is to develop better and clearer guidelines on retention. Actually, could you pass out the brochure? So what is it that's up there in the Bovey room? What is it that we have to offer? I'm not going to walk through the entire slide. Greg is passing out a brochure. It has this information plus more. And if you are joining us remotely and you want a copy of the brochure, you can connect with Dorene and she will get that to you. So the first key point is we have lots of types of records. I think most people have an image of an archives as just being stuffy, dirty old documents, but we have much, much more than that. And on the right, on the topics, we have a whole range of subject areas on which we maintain records. And in fact, the list that you see on the slide is actually our high-level categories according to which we catalog all of our materials. So everything that, when we get into the cataloging, you'll see that that everything has to fit under a category. So. And then just in the lower corner, you have to remember that everything is not in the Bovey room. So we have partnered with the Needlers, working on their records and cataloging everything that is all through the building. We've worked with the Fine Arts Board to catalog the fine arts collection that exists throughout our building. And we have also cataloged all of the historical objects and furnishings that can be found throughout the building. So it's not just in the Bovey room. So who are we now? Well, the archives has been around since the 1970s. There have been many, many volunteers through that time. Today, we have a committee, and on that committee, there are 6 of us. Dorene, now that she is the archivist, is the chair of the committee. And all committee members do some type of volunteer work and work on projects. In addition, we have others who either don't have the time or the desire to be on a committee, but enjoy doing some of the work. And you'll see Tom, who's here, working on his photographs of building and grounds. And I also want to mention Tony Smith, who is also here today. Before July 1, he would have been listed as a committee member. He was a committee member for about 2 decades and also served as our secretary. And we're delighted that he is continuing with us as a volunteer. So, we have some challenges today. The first challenge is use of the archives has increased significantly over the past decade. And that's good, that's what we want. However, it also is a resource issue, so that's a challenge. Also, the archives profession has really changed fundamentally over the last 2 or 3 decades. First of all, the amount of information has grown exponentially. And there's a couple things behind this. One is that Plymouth members have an immense amount of energy and enthusiasm and do a lot of things. And it seems to just keep growing. And how do we get our arms around all that's going on so that we can preserve that energy and enthusiasm for future generations? I mean, we have boards, we have committees, we have working groups, we have task forces, we have initiatives, and it's really a challenge to keep up with all of that. And then the other piece to this is that information is shared via constantly changing media. It's not just on paper, it's podcasts, it's live streaming, it's all sorts of things. So there is just an explosion of information that we need to somehow get our arms around. Then also we get into the issue of digital records. Today, paper is the exception and digital records are the rule. And we are not prepared at this point to deal with that digital world. And first of all, what should we save? There's so much out there. How should it be saved? We can put everything on a drive, but we've got to find it too. We have to find things. And what it's a huge issue that we just feel that we don't have the resources to get our arms around now. How can we migrate to new technologies? Digital technology is changing all of the time. So if there's something that we want to preserve long-term, we have to be in a position to be able to continuously migrate the digital record to new technologies. And that's a huge challenge. How can we preserve what is still the gold standard for the archives, which is paper records? And that means if something is digital today and we don't have a printed record of it, we should try to get one. If we have an oral history, we should have it transcribed so we have a paper record too. So that's another huge challenge. And for those of us working in the archives, cataloging, accessing records, those technologies are constantly changing and we have to keep up with that. And then finally, electronic expectations for electronic access keep growing, especially true for younger people and for our external partners who would like to be able to get at what we have. So we are facing a lot of challenges right now. And how can we move into the future? Well, we're always going to continue doing what we're doing now, but we have concluded that the archives profession requires new skill sets beyond what current Plymouth volunteers can do. We believe that the archives needs a part-time professional lead worker to incorporate the new skills and expectations into our operations, and that requires a new sustainable source of support, which we don't have today. We have always looked for external and other sources of support, such as internships, grant money, but they're really very limited options that are available. So, concluding this part, until we can get new skill sets and resources, we feel we are very constrained in our ability to manage our digital records and very limited in trying to increase electronic access to a broader audience, which is something we really want to do. So that's kind of the quick overview of the archivist hat. And I'm going to turn it over to Hal, who is going to dig a little deeper into our stories. And I think this shows two things. One, we've got a lot of interesting records in the archives. And the other is, as we dig deeper, you know, some of the old stories we heard might not actually be the whole story.
Good morning. Well, as you probably know, Plymouth's first pastor was Norman MacLeod, a man who came from Montreal and assisted in the formation of Plymouth. Unfortunately, his pastorate was quite brief. And the traditional narrative, the prevailing narrative concerning the end of his pastorate is that in 1859, the members of Plymouth were unified in their support of abolitionism and fired MacLeod because he did not adequately give voice to their anti-slavery convictions. Now that makes for a good story. But when you look at the records of Plymouth, a slightly different picture emerges. The records show that Plymouth was not unified. There were a number of heated church meetings early in 1859. And after a number of those meetings, the church voted to poll each member of the congregation, asking each member to state in writing whether MacLeod should be retained as the pastor. 13 members voted to retain him. 20 voted not to retain him. That's about a 60-40 split. In order to resolve the matter, Plymouth, again, as a congregation, voted to call a council of sister congregational churches in the area to help them resolve the problem. A further review of the records indicates that MacLeod's stance on slavery was not the issue. For example, in 1858, the congregation voted unanimously to approve anti-slavery language MacLeod had drafted at their request. More important, when the council convened at Plymouth's request, the council told Plymouth to submit formal charges against MacLeod. It did that in 13 printed charges. Not one of the charges identified MacLeod's stance on slavery as problematic. In fact, contrasting with the silence about slavery, one of the 12 specifically charged MacLeod for failure to speak out against alcohol. The charge said, MacLeod has forfeited our confidence in him as a Christian minister by neglecting the cause of temperance. Now, alcohol caused profound social problems. A recent study of Frontier, Minnesota, conducted under the auspices of the University of Minnesota and St. Cloud State, has shown that for Congregationalist reformers in Minnesota, and especially St. Anthony, the concern was less about slavery than with the need for general moral reform, especially the creation of a whiskey-free society. The manufacture and sale of alcohol in Minnesota was unregulated. And there was some really bad stuff for sale in the saloons. Alcohol caused crime, violence, and social disorder. The effect of alcohol on the community was akin to the effect of opioids in our society today. Viewing alcohol as the source of the problem helps illuminate the nature of the split in the congregation. At least in part, the division in Plymouth reflects a split in the church between Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats were firmly convinced that the government should keep its, excuse me. The Democrats were firmly convinced that the government should keep its hands off matters of personal morality, like alcohol. We should note that Norman MacLeod, our first pastor, Norman MacLeod's brother was Martin MacLeod. Martin MacLeod was an influential leader of the Minnesota Democratic Party. He was a key ally of Democrat Henry Sibley, the first governor of the state. Martin was the author of the compromise that made St. Paul the capital of the state, gave St. Anthony the state university, and gave Stillwater the state prison. Martin was also one of the architects of the Dakota Treaty of 1851. McLeod County is named after Martin McLeod, Norman's brother. Norman, our pastor, was close to Martin. He came to Minnesota from Montreal in the early 1850s to visit Martin and stayed on, living at Martin's farm in Bloomington. Norman may have been regarded by Plymouth members as linked to the Democratic Party because of his close ties with his brother. On the other hand, Plymouth Republicans were allied with a network of Congregationalist reformers centered in St. Anthony, led by Charles Seacombe, who was the pastor of the First Congregational Church of St. Anthony. Those reformers thought the government should be closely allied with Protestant churches in legislating to reform society, especially to prohibit alcohol. Norman's perceived connection to the Minnesota Democratic Party may have been emphasized by the contrast between Norman and Henry Nichols. Nichols, our second pastor, was the polar opposite of MacLeod. MacLeod, by all accounts, was a quiet, reserved, scholarly man. As we've noted, closely tied to the Minnesota Democratic Party, reluctant to speak out about alcohol. Nichols was the best known preacher and lecturer in the state of Minnesota. He was well known to the Plymouth congregation because he spoke frequently in St. Anthony and Minneapolis. Henry Nichols was opposed to slavery, but he was primarily known for his advocacy of the prohibition of alcohol. And he gave fiery sermons opposed to alcohol. Henry Nichols was closely tied to the St. Anthony Congregationalist reformers. When he came to Minnesota in the early 1850s, Henry Nichols settled in St. Anthony. He was one of the men who formed the Minnesota Republican Party. He was on the steering committee of the Minnesota Republican Party. He allied with Charles Seacombe to form the Congregational Conference of Minnesota. And when Charles Seacombe was invested as the pastor of the First Congregational Church of St. Anthony, Henry Martin Nichols preached the sermon. Now, when the council called by Plymouth convened, it was constituted as an impartial tribunal. Charles Seacombe, the dean of congregational ministers in Minnesota, was the most powerful member of the council and convened it, but he exerted his influence in the background. The council refused Plymouth's initial attempt to convene the council on an ex parte basis. And the council insisted that MacLeod and Plymouth mutually request the council, which they did. Pastors and deacons from congregational churches in St. Paul, Winona, and Prescott took leadership roles in the council. Seacombe and one of the deacons from the St. Anthony Church were members of the council but took no part in it. The council appointed a lawyer for MacLeod and recognized two prominent Plymouth members who were lawyers as counsel to prosecute the charges against MacLeod. The council proceeded as a formal trial. There were opening statements by the lawyers, the examination of witnesses, and closing arguments. The council's resolution of the problem suggests that the council was attempting, first, to move MacLeod out of Plymouth while preserving his reputation so that he could serve elsewhere. Second, to begin the process of healing the divisions in Plymouth Church. And third, to pave the way for a new pastor. The council rejected all of the charges the church had made against him that impugned his character. But the council found that MacLeod had, quote, used severe and unjustifiable language respecting the church and individual members of it, close quote. Therefore, it said there was no realistic prospect that he could ever again be an effective pastor of Plymouth Church. But it found that he could serve effectively elsewhere. Thus, in spite of the established narrative, Plymouth Church did not fire its first pastor. A council of sister congregational churches moved Norman MacLeod out, preserving a semblance of his character so that he could move on and be pastor of the congregational church elsewhere. The council refused to deal with any of the other charges Plymouth made against MacLeod. I think probably because to do so would simply have caused deeper divisions in the church. The council concluded with an earnest prayer. The council concluded with an earnest prayer that God will soon provide Plymouth a pastor to break unto them the bread of life. Starting in December of 1859, that new pastor was Henry Nichols. His pastorate was marked by fiery sermons, in response to one of which the women of Plymouth Church marched on the saloons, demanding that the saloon keepers shut them down. But my time is out, and that's another story.
So, of our presenters? Jerry, I think I saw your hand first. Do you want to come up to the mic, or do you just want to yell your question out and I can repeat it for the remote audience?
How do you deal with contemporary issues? For example, the tapestry has been obviously an issue for the last 5 years. Do you deal with contemporary things as an archivist, or do you just deal with things that have gone on? And if you do deal with them, how do you decide what to say that may be very interesting about the issue in 50 years?
I'll do my best to repeat that question. It kind of grew. So the question was, how do you, the archivist, deal with contemporary issues in the church? The example was the embroidery issue. What do you decide to save? How do you decide what to save? Did that capture it pretty much?
I think so. And I think our current perspective that we want future generations to get a full picture, it guides us in retention. So we actually have worked hard on the embroidery issue right up to what's going on right now, to give a full story and not a one-sided story.
Okay, I saw several other hands out there. Karen? Do you want to come up to the mic? You can feel free to do that. Thanks.
So,
I think you can pull it out of the.
I think it's okay now. Quick question. Of the 33 people who voted, members who voted, were women able to vote at that time? Or were these just men that were voting?
And most of the 33 were probably women.
Okay.
Demographically, most church membership was made up of women.
Hal, could you please come up to the mic to answer that, just so the remote audience can hear as well? Thank you.
Most of those 33 people who voted were probably women. Demographically, throughout America in the 19th century, women made up the preponderance of members of churches. Roughly 75 to 90% of church members were women. So men could attend church and were recognized as stated listeners. Without being full members of the church, they could be recognized as participants in the church. But most of those 33 were probably women.
Okay, I saw some other hands earlier. Okay.
I won't go to the microphone. That's a quick question, more of a curiosity. What did become of McLeod after he left Plymouth? Does the archive show anything?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So the question is, what became of Reverend McLeod after he left Plymouth?
Norman McLeod was pastor of another congregational church until the Civil War broke out. Then he joined a Wisconsin regiment and served in the Union Army. After the war, he went to Salt Lake and attempted to form congregational churches in Salt Lake. He was strongly opposed to Mormonism and led crusades against Mormonism in Salt Lake City, Utah. Unsuccessfully.
Okay.
My question is, the position of the alcohol in the early church, is that why we serve grape juice and why we don't serve liquor in the church?
Okay. So the question is, given the position on alcohol, anti-alcohol in the early church, is that why we use grape juice in communion today? I don't know. Can anyone answer that? Mary?
I've heard that that's the case. I suspect it's not. I think there's a lot of Protestant churches that serve grape juice and don't serve alcohol. And I don't think, we could look at like trustee minutes, because the old trustees were the ones who, could make an exception to the rule, to see whether that history is influencing the decision. But we don't know, but I suspect that that's not the root of it.
Right. Yeah.
Just a quick question about the archives themselves. Could you or somebody give an example or two of how people outside the church have made use of archives?
When I started 12 years ago, we got virtually no requests from within Plymouth. And the majority of requests were from outside of Plymouth. Typical requests would be people who are working on family history, wanting to get membership information. There have been a couple doctoral students who are working on issues. One had, they wanted information on the women in ministry stained glass, because the dissertation was on, I think was her name, can't remember now, but the main woman in the stained glass. And then some historians are interested in seeing what we might have on a particular topic. And one in particular that shows the value of having that external connection. I don't know if any of you recall, there was a Flame article on William Morris, who was a Black member of the church at the turn of the century. And somebody was doing research on something totally else, but came across the fact that William Morris was an attorney for the person. So he kind of started getting interested in William Morris. Well, at the turn of the century, the only record we had of William Morris was the little card, and up in the corner, it said colored. And so we learned a lot about William Morris from this historian, and have just, I mean, it's just an amazing story. So, well, we do have some things on the Minnesota Digital Library. I think in the brochure, there's reference to the website. And there's, I think, we just have, the history of Plymouth is the history of Minneapolis, it's the history of Minnesota. It's not just about the church. And so I think there are huge opportunities to open up that access.
I'm not seeing any questions typed into the Q&A box, but just a reminder, final chance for those in the remote audience to type in a question quickly if you have it. Any more questions from the audience, please?
I do have one more question.
Wonderful.
I remember taking a tour of the archives probably 10 to 15 years ago when it was down in the church's basement, and there were vast amounts of unorganized materials in musty corners. I wondered what portion of that history and those archives have now been cataloged. How far along have you been in the process?
Okay, so the question was, somebody remembers a tour of the archives years ago, and there were vast stores of uncatalogued material. So what is the current status of cataloging, and are there still vast stores of uncatalogued material?
For documents, we've really been plugging away at the cataloging, and it's something that will never, ever be finished. But for documents, I think we are, in terms of old records, I would say we are more than 2/3 of the way having cataloged that. And at the same time, we're trying to keep up to date with what's being generated today. So we still have, Dorene has been working a long time on Howard Kahn materials, going through that. Tom Anderson spent literally years cataloging building and grounds, and now he's working on photographs. So we still have to do a lot more on photographs, but we are making good progress. And guess what we can do now? We can search a topic, find out what we have, and know where to find it.
Okay. So we're at the point in our schedule where we need to thank our presenters for a wonderful job. I'm going to set this down so I can applaud as well. Thank you so much. Enlightening in a variety of ways, and I think you'll get feedback and follow-up based on this. We have a couple more presentations coming up in Sunday Forum this summer, including one next Sunday, which you might not know about. An event, it's called Art, Meditation, and Finding Our Inner Story. The presenters are Richard Jewell, whom you may know as the film club person and husband of Anne Ludlow, father of Gabe Jewell, and I'll mention him more in just a moment. But so Richard will be presenting on art, meditation, and finding our inner story. This event focuses on the Minnesota Impressions showing by Gabe Jewell, who was actually my wife Carol and I had him as a junior high student years ago here in Plymouth and remember him fondly. Gabe has become a lifelong artist. He has 80 works showing in the Plymouth Con Art Gallery. The opening of that show will be next Sunday, and Gabe will be here as part of that opening. So please come and take a look at that. And he's a very interesting artist, and I think you'll find the art worthwhile. But many of the artworks are illustrations for an online thing that Richard has created called meditationary.org, an online meditation dictionary. So Richard says, art tells a story. One of the functions of meditation is for each of us to find our own truest and most real stories. And the storyteller in the midst of it. So Richard and Gabe will be doing a presentation for Sunday Forum next Sunday, so please come back and join us for that. And then our last one of the summer will be August 14th. How did it all begin? So this is Lawrence Rudnick, Professor Emeritus and Distinguished Teaching Professor Emeritus from the School of Physics and Astronomy at the U, talking about how did it all begin? This question challenges both our scientific mind and the deepest tenets of our faith. So please join us for that presentation in August. So again, thank you so much, and that concludes our program this morning.